Now, if we put A7 up on the screen, this is a shout out to Kyle. He compiled a list. And, you know, there were a lot of lists bouncing around, actually, because the LFG mentality of the Minnesota DFL folks, led by Tim Walz, has actually been an LFG agenda.
Yeah.
That's the Let's Effing Go agenda, which, Ryan, you've followed very closely and you can tell us more about. But it has resulted in this insane list of bills and actions that Tim Walz has signed or spearheaded just in the last couple of years in Minnesota. And it's a very interesting sort of collection of both cultural progressivism and economic populism that has left-right appeal. Sohrab Ahmari wrote a piece in Compact immediately after Walz was nominated or was picked yesterday, saying that Republicans can learn a lot from the economic populism of Tim Walz and supporting a lot of Tim Walz's sort of economic agenda. So that said, tell us, Ryan, a little bit about what the Minnesota DFL folks have been doing under Walz, because the reason he started to, I think, rise to the top of the surface of the candidates is people looked at it and realized, holy smokes, yeah, what they've been doing in Minnesota is extremely impressive.
Although I wonder if he rose in spite of that, because this is the kind of thing that would actually scare, I think, national Democrats. But
calm down.
Yeah, Emily and I had talked months ago about doing a story about how several years ago, Minnesota and Iowa were both swing states, both purple states, and to some degree, Minnesota still is. In the 2018 election, Minnesota went blue by just like a handful of votes, and again, a trifecta as well. Walz as governor, Democrats took control of both houses. I think they took the House by like 1 seat, and you know these House races are decided by hundreds of votes, sometimes just dozens of votes. And on the other side of the border in Iowa, a state that had, you know, recently had Democratic governors, senators, et cetera, and would, you know, I did Obama win Iowa?
Yeah, I think she did.
That state went Republican trifecta, and they pushed through as aggressive a conservative agenda as they possibly could. But it's the kind of mirror version of Minnesota in the sense that it's very pro-business, not the kind of Vancian, Trumpian national populism economics. And then it was the extremely conservative social stuff as well.
Yep.
And just across the border, with just a few thousand votes pushing the state blue, they pushed through. And we can put up this Kyle tweet again, as he runs it down: universal free school meals. That's why you see that picture of the kids hugging him. Legal weed. Carbon-free electricity by 2040, tax rebates for the working class up to $1,300, 12 weeks paid family leave, 12 weeks paid sick leave. And then he banned conversion therapy, there's a pro-trans stuff, 12 weeks gun, and then he did gun stuff, free public college for people making under $80,000. To me, like the ban on forever chemicals that's hard to get like political power behind, because everybody supports it, but there's nobody pushing for it.
Minnesota is people don't realize it is a big business state as well. Huge. Minneapolis is a huge business hub. There are a lot of very powerful corporate interests in Minneapolis.
Corporations and warehouses.
Yeah.
And an increase in K through 12 funding, and then a bunch of pro-union stuff as well. And he vetoed a gig worker reform bill, and said he would come back with a compromise version, because Uber and Lyft had threatened to leave if it passed. And he did come back with a compromise version. So normally when a Democrat wins by a couple dozen votes, they reach across the aisle. They say, we can't govern as if we won a huge mandate. We have to, tread lightly here and basically be a center-right party. Right. They said no. We believe our agenda is popular. Right. We believe the Republican agenda is unpopular. We're going to push ours through, and we're going to run on that. Yeah. And it's like they basically haven't done that anywhere, except maybe New York after all those DSA people took over the legislature.
But even so, it's a completely different thing. And this is one of the...
Doing it in Minnesota is different than doing it in New York.
It's a conversation actually that's been very popular with the J.D. Vance types on the right, because there's this, I go back to this a lot. Ronald Reagan gave this famous speech where he talked about painting with, not with pale pastels, but with bold colors. Bold colors, not pale pastels. And it's sort of a famous saying, but people, now associate Reagan with squishy sort of neoliberalism, when in fact the Reagan Revolution was very much a revolution. It was a war against the centrists in the Republican Party that had, it was, people hated Ronald Reagan in the Republican Party and in DC. And his theory of the case was always that if you are an ideological conservative, you will be politically benefited by not trying to hide that. So you can talk about it ideologically, whether it's more, honest and moral to go about that. But his theory was that it's more politically beneficial to just be honest about if you have bold beliefs. It's sort of the Barry Goldwater, and Reagan was a Goldwater supporter when he says extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. That is the theory. And I think that is true in many cases. Obviously, your elections, who your opponent is, all of those things depend. But Tim Walz is a version of that on the left, which is, I believe these things, and I'm going to make Minnesota a trans refuge, as it was dubbed by the AP. Now, I think those policies that he's pushed through as they relate to children are awful and will not be well sold on the national stage. They will be a problem for him on the national stage. But I respect the hell out of him for being honest about the fact that he is a cultural progressive in a rural state that, in northern Minnesota, Donald Trump did a rally in Duluth. I mean, that is crazy for Republicans to do rallies and draw thousands of people in a place like Duluth. It's just, that is a changing state. And I think Tim Walz is putting that theory to the test. And Democrats, for people like you, Ryan, who probably come down on that same theory of the case that I believe in and that I would hope that Republicans would follow. On the left, it's sort of like a validation. It's saying like, look, this guy is doing the damn thing.
Right.
We can do it too. Like, you don't have to pretend that you are just like Mr. Joe Biden, who just gets along, Scranton Joe, gets along with everybody and doesn't have any controversial ideas. You can say that you believe something that's unpopular.
Yeah, and I think the same way that Republicans had a hard time painting Joe Biden as a far lefty, I think they're going to struggle with Tim Walz. And it's identitarianism, but it's working in Democrats' favor, because you're like, oh, this like old white guy can't be
It can't be that bad.
Can't be a flaming radical communist.
Right.
Just the effort to paint Joe Biden as that, and I know really. It frustrated Republicans that he could be basically lined up with Bernie Sanders on a lot of his domestic agenda that he was getting through. Yeah. And it just wasn't landing on him because he's Scranton Joe or whatever. Right. And I think we'll see, because Joe Biden had been in the public eye for 50 years. And maybe that matters in a significant way, more so than just his identity as like a normal-looking white guy. Yeah. But we're going to find out, because they went and found this normal-looking white guy, and Republicans are already saying he's the most radical, nut job ever. We'll talk about this in the next block. Most radical nut job ever to walk the face of the earth, and it's like, we'll see if that works or not.
And if people like you, so if you're just a generally likable person, that's the same thing with Reagan. Reagan did have ideas that were unpopular and out of step with a lot of the country.
Right, look at him smiling.
Yeah, right, no, but that's exactly right. And so with Tim Walz, you can call him radical, and I think on certain cultural issues, he is radical. And he would, people on the left would say, like, these are radical, populist economic policies. He probably wouldn't embrace that label, but just last week, he was saying one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. Like, he hasn't sprinted in the opposite direction from any of this. Now, the electoral implications are fascinating, though, because all of this depends on the coalition that you can put together. And Saagar made a really good point about this on Twitter, X, yesterday.
We can go on Twitter. It's fine.
We'll go on Twitter, yeah. I refuse to think of it as X, but anyway. Saagar said his job is not to activate blue-collar voters, in reference to Walz. He said it's to activate affluent white suburban liberals who like feeling he could appeal to blue-collar voters. And Saagar then clarified he didn't mean that in a bad way. He meant that it was like, this is a successful pick who is they have said this is the goal, and it's not a dumb goal. and he's someone who can accomplish it. But let's watch the Steve Kornacki clip explaining how Walz did in different parts of Minnesota, because Minnesota is one of those states that's very much coming apart right now, to borrow the famous phrase, between Minneapolis and some of those rural, especially northern parts. So here's Kornacki on how Walz has performed in different parts of the state.
Now, here's the key, because this county, Democrats used to be much more competitive in. Look at this. In 2012, Barack Obama won 43% of the vote in this county. It was only a little bit more than 10 points that he lost to Romney by here. The floor fell out for Democrats here when Trump came along in that Clinton race in 2016, and they haven't recovered it since. And that Walz performance here, it's a little less than Biden's number. It's more than Clinton's, and it's a far cry from what Obama was doing here. And again, I'm showing you one. This is a stand-in for dozens of counties in Minnesota where you saw the same thing, with large rural populations, blue-collar white populations, where Obama, in some of them he was winning, others he was holding his own just a dozen years ago. This is where Democrats have lost ground. And Walz in 2022, he didn't gain any ground that the Democrats had lost. He didn't do that here. He didn't do that in other counties. Walz really owes his victory, that that margin he got 8 points there statewide, he owes it to the Twin Cities area here, the area where Democrats in Minnesota and all these other states are already doing well. You know, look at his electoral history. Tim Walz is in 2022, and the idea that he's got this automatic appeal with these small town areas in those three key battleground states, you don't see it in what he actually did on the ballot in 2022.
So all that is to say, Beltway pundits should be very, very careful to assume that Tim Walz, being the governor of Minnesota, means that he is reflexively or categorically popular and easily sold and packaged throughout the rural Midwest, because his own electoral victory was heavily dependent on the most urban part of his state, which is Minneapolis, which is also a booming metropolis. So that is a very, very important, I think, piece of nuance in the big Tim Walz story.
The only amendment I would have to that is that if Democrats can maintain Biden's share of the rural white vote, basically, white working class vote, as brought more broadly, then they will win. And so that's the only caution on that, on those stats, is that Biden, did better than Hillary Clinton, and that with Walz, sticking close to Biden, that's, rather than that, you could look at that two ways. One, it would be like, oh wow, he didn't outrun the national ticket, so therefore he doesn't actually appeal that well. But you could also say, well, Joe Biden actually outran the kind of normal Democrat that would have, how a normal Democrat would have performed. Biden did better, just because of his whole shtick.
He's likable.
And Walz also stuck with Biden in that direction. But nobody should be fooled and think that because there's like a Harris Walz camo hat, that they're going to win rural America, or that they're going to even do that much better than an average Democrat.
Yeah.
Because it's still Harris and Walz.
Right.
But I don't know. Yeah, it's a do no harm thing. He's not hated in rural America. In the way that kind of Hillary Clinton was.
Yes.
So,
and that Kamala Harris may come to be, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. If she wins, it's going to be an interesting 4 years. That's for sure.
Sure will.
Stick around for that.
I was in rural Pennsylvania a couple years ago, and the amount of F Joe Biden signs were surprising even to me. Just on total dirt back roads with bolt holes in them, just F Joe Biden.
Oh yeah, it's wild. Yeah.
Yeah, not a lot of love for Democrats in a lot of those places these days.
My uncle in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, kept arguing with this guy who had a sign right at the front of town that said F Joe Biden. He's like, this makes us, think whatever you want about Joe Biden. Can you have I don't like Joe Biden. I like Trump.
Screw Joe Biden.
Anything. This makes us look so trashy. Do you have any pride in this town? Come on. No. The answer was no.
Yeah, the answer was actually probably hell no. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.